Once, thinking meant friction. It meant sitting with an idea long enough for it to resist you, to push back, to force you into uncertainty. Today, thinking has been quietly replaced by something far more efficient and far more dangerous: repetition. Opinions now move faster than understanding ever could, and speed has become the primary measure of intelligence. To think is slow. To repeat is instant. And in a culture addicted to immediacy, instant always wins. What we call having an opinion is often nothing more than borrowing a finished conclusion and wearing it as identity. The words feel familiar, the certainty feels comforting, and the discomfort of not knowing is avoided entirely. This is how open thinking begins to die. Not through censorship, but through convenience. Understanding requires effort, and effort feels like resistance inside the mind. It creates tension, ambiguity, and the unsettling realization that you might be wrong. Repetition, on the other hand, offers relief. It gives the illusion of participation without the cost of cognition. When people repeat ideas they've inherited, they feel informed without having to confront complexity. Over time, this habit reshapes the mind itself. Curiosity shrinks. Questions feel inefficient. Nuance becomes suspicious. Thinking stops being a process and becomes a position to defend. Once an idea is adopted as identity, examining it feels like self-destruction. So, people protect beliefs instead of exploring them, defend narratives instead of understanding reality, and mistake confidence for clarity. This shift didn't happen because people became incapable of thought. It happened because modern life rewards certainty, not comprehension. The loudest ideas spread first, not the truest ones, and once repetition becomes the social currency of belonging, open thinking becomes risky. To question is to hesitate. To hesitate is to fall behind. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mind learns that safety lies in alignment, not exploration. This is the foundation of limited thinking, not ignorance, but the learned fear of complexity. And once that fear takes root, the mind begins to seek comfort over truth, setting the stage for something far larger, where technology, identity, and emotion step in to finish what repetition started. The human mind was never designed to crave truth. It was designed to seek safety. Complexity feels like danger because it destabilizes what we think we know, and the brain interprets that instability as a threat. Simplicity, by contrast, offers relief. Clear answers calm the nervous system. Clean narratives reduce friction. Certainty feels like ground beneath your feet. Over time, this preference hardens into habit, and habit quietly becomes worldview. People do not reject complex ideas because they are false, but because they are uncomfortable. Complexity demands patience, emotional regulation, and the willingness to remain suspended between possibilities without reaching for closure. Most minds would rather land on a flawed answer than linger in uncertainty. This is where cognitive comfort begins to replace curiosity. Ideas are no longer approached as questions to explore, but as shelters to hide within. The moment an explanation feels emotionally satisfying, investigation stops. Doubt is reframed as weakness. Ambiguity is treated as incompetence. The mind learns that the fastest way to psychological relief is not understanding, but resolution, even if that resolution is shallow. Over time, this rewires attention itself. People stop asking how something works and start asking which side it belongs to. Information is no longer weighed, it is filtered for emotional alignment. What agrees is absorbed instantly. What challenges is dismissed before it can unfold. The fear of complexity does not announce itself openly. It disguises itself as common sense, as realism, as being practical or grounded. But beneath that mask is a deeper anxiety, the fear of being wrong, of losing orientation, of having to rebuild meaning from the ground up. True thinking requires exactly that kind of collapse, the temporary loss of certainty that precedes clarity. Yet in a world that equates speed with competence, few are willing to endure that internal free fall. And so minds narrow, not because they lack intelligence, but because comfort becomes more valuable than truth. Once that trade is made, the door opens for external systems to step in, offering ready-made certainty, reinforcing identity, and completing the quiet transformation from open inquiry to closed belief. Once the mind learns to seek comfort, it becomes easy to guide. This is where technology enters, not as a villain, but as an accelerant. Algorithms do not create closed minds, they simply adapt to them. Their purpose is not to inform or enlighten, but to predict, to hold attention, to reduce uncertainty into patterns that can be monetized. And the easiest patterns to reinforce are the ones already emotionally charged. Over time, the algorithm learns you better than you know yourself, not because it understands you, but because it measures what you hesitate over, what you linger on, what you return to when you feel unsettled. Curiosity, which thrives on the unknown, becomes inefficient in this environment. The system does not reward exploration, it rewards consistency. Slowly, ideas stop being something you engage with and start becoming something you identify with. Beliefs harden into labels. Labels turn into tribes. And once identity enters the picture, thinking changes its role entirely. The question is no longer, is this true, but is this mine? Agreement feels like belonging. Disagreement feels like attack. The mind, once open and exploratory, becomes defensive by default. It scans information not for insight, but for threat. Anything that destabilizes the narrative is filtered out before it can take root. This is how intellectual curiosity collapses. Not because information disappears, but because attention becomes selective in the service of identity. In this state, thinking becomes reactive instead of reflective. People consume endless content without ever digesting it. They mistake exposure for understanding and familiarity for depth. The mind is always busy, yet rarely engaged. It jumps from conclusion to conclusion, never staying long enough to ask why. And because the system continuously feeds back what feels right, the illusion of insight grows stronger with every interaction. The closed loop tightens. The more certain someone feels, the less they question. The less they question, the easier they are to predict. And in that predictability, open thinking suffocates quietly, replaced by a curated reality where curiosity has no room to breathe, and the mind mistakes reinforcement for truth. When thinking narrows, society feels it long before individuals name it. Conversations lose depth and become performances of allegiance. Disagreement no longer invites dialogue. It triggers defense. People speak past one another, armed with conclusions but empty of curiosity. Polarization is not merely political, it is cognitive. Minds trained to protect identity cannot tolerate ambiguity, and ambiguity is the soil where understanding grows. As complexity is stripped away, human interactions flatten. Everything becomes binary, urgent, moralized. Nuance sounds like betrayal. Silence is interpreted as weakness. In this atmosphere, the social fabric tightens into rigid camps, each convinced of its clarity, each increasingly unable to listen. The psychological toll is subtle but profound. Constant certainty requires constant vigilance. When beliefs are fragile beneath the surface, they must be defended loudly and often. This creates exhaustion. People feel mentally overloaded, emotionally reactive, perpetually on edge, yet rarely fulfilled. Fragility emerges not from sensitivity, but from over-identification with ideas that were never fully understood. A challenge to a belief feels like a challenge to the self. Correction feels like humiliation. Growth feels like loss. And so, many retreat into echo chambers where validation replaces connection and agreement substitutes for trust. This erosion of open thinking reshapes empathy as well. When minds close, complexity in others becomes inconvenient. People are reduced to labels, motives simplified, intentions assumed. Understanding another human being requires the same patience as understanding a difficult idea, and both demand openness. Without it, compassion thins. The social world becomes louder but lonelier, more connected yet less human. What emerges is not a society of conviction, but one of fatigue, where mental shortcuts replace reflection and emotional burnout masquerades as moral certainty. In such an environment, the cost of closed minds is paid collectively, in broken dialogue, shallow relationships, and a growing sense that something essential has been lost, even if few can articulate exactly what it is. Open thinking does not return through force, nor through louder arguments or better slogans. It begins quietly, with the willingness to feel discomfort without immediately resolving it. To think openly is to slow the reflex to conclude, to resist the urge to collapse complexity into certainty, and to remain present long enough for an idea to unfold on its own terms. This kind of thinking feels inefficient at first. It offers no instant reward, no immediate identity, no clear side to stand on. Instead, it demands patience, humility, and the courage to admit that understanding is always provisional. Yet this discomfort is not a flaw. It is the signal that the mind is alive again. Reclaiming open thinking means redefining strength. Strength is not rigid certainty, but the ability to hold conflicting ideas without panic. It is the capacity to revise beliefs without experiencing it as erasure. When the mind loosens its grip on identity, curiosity returns naturally. Questions regain their power. Listening becomes possible again, not as a strategy, but as an orientation toward reality. This is where intellectual freedom begins, not in knowing more, but in needing less certainty to feel whole. In a world optimized for reaction, choosing reflection is an act of resistance. It interrupts the feedback loops that thrive on predictability. It restores agency over attention, allowing thought to move beyond reinforcement and into discovery. Open thinking does not promise comfort, but it offers something deeper: coherence. A mind that can adapt without collapsing, that can engage without hardening, that can encounter difference without fear. When individuals reclaim this capacity, something shifts beneath the surface of culture itself. Conversations slow, meaning deepens, and the death of open thinking reveals itself not as an inevitability, but as a reversible condition, one choice at a time, made in the quiet space where curiosity is allowed to breathe again.